Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you for selecting my video. In today's video, we will answer the question that many beginners ask, that is, what kind of tools do I need to bake sourdough bread? Now what you'll find is that many of the things that you need are common household items that you already have in your kitchen. There are a few specialized items that you will need, so I'll point out the common items, the specialized items, and I'll talk about some different options that you have along the way. Now what you'll see today as I go through the tools that are required is that I love tools. I pretty much have almost everything. I have a workshop full of tools. I have a lot of kitchen gadgets. So I'll show you everything I have, but you don't need all these things, and I'll try to indicate which ones you need and which ones you don't. So let's get started. So first, let's talk about the tools that are needed for starter maintenance. So with your sourdough starter, I maintain mine once a day. I leave it on my countertop. You also have the option to do refrigerator maintenance, where you keep your starter in the refrigerator and you feed it once a week. It doesn't really matter. You pretty much need the same set of tools. So these are the things that generally you'll need. The first one is a starter container. I use this 1 pint ball jar with the plastic screw-on lid. What I recommend for your container is a straight walled jar. If you have a jar with a narrow neck on it, it's very difficult to get in there and stir up your starter and keep it clean. So this is a very easy, clean option. I also like the screw-on lid because you want to keep your starter slightly open when it's sitting on your countertop. So I screw it on, then I back it off one. But when it's in your refrigerator, you want to screw it on tightly, so you have the option of both. These jars come with the 2-part metal lids. I really don't prefer those. They're just messy to work with. You can buy these plastic lids separately. And then with your starter, you also want to have your rubber band on here, or some people will do this with a marker, which is your indicator of your height after you're feeding, so that you can see how much your starter has risen after feeding. So that's your starter jar, pretty straightforward. The second thing that you need is a digital scale. This is the most important tool that you need for bread baking, not just for starter maintenance, but throughout the entire process. If you don't have a digital scale, you really need to go buy one. These are relatively inexpensive. You can buy a scale at a kitchen store for, I think, $12 or $14. The features that you want to look for in a scale are pretty basic. You want to be able to measure things in grams, because almost all the recipes that you'll work with are using the metric system. And the second feature that I would recommend is you want one that would be easy to clean when it's covered with flour, because you're going to get flour everywhere when you're baking. This one actually is a bad example. I had this before I started sourdough baking, and this has a gap between the glass and the scale, so you get flour inside that gap. It's very difficult to keep clean. If I had to buy another one of these when this one bites the dust, I'll definitely get one that's easier to clean, that doesn't have that gap in there. So you need a kitchen scale. Another thing that I use that a lot of people, you don't see this, is I love these small thermometers. This is called a refrigerator thermometer. I think I bought 4 of these for $12. I keep this with my starter at all times. You'll notice when you do sourdough baking throughout the entire process, you're constantly measuring the temperature. You should be. You should know what the temperature of your starter is. You should know what the temperature of your dough is. You want to test the temperature of your proofing chamber. If you're proofing your dough somewhere other than your countertop, you want to know what your refrigerator temperature is if you're doing an overnight proof in the refrigerator. So I actually have 4 of these little thermometers. I use these all the time. So I keep one with my starter on the top of my refrigerator, so I always know what the temperature is up there. Very, very handy tool, because knowing your temperature is an incredibly important component of baking sourdough bread. And then for mixing up the flour and water, if your starter calls for a blend of flours, mine is a 50-50 blend of bread flour and whole wheat flour, I find it useful to do a premix of the flour once a week. So what I'll do is I'll put 7 days worth of my bread flour and 7 days worth of whole wheat flour in here, and then I leave room and I can shake this up so that I get a perfectly blended mix. And then I'm only dealing with this one container every day when I'm feeding. If I had to take out 2 bags of flour and you're spilling flour everywhere every time you open the bag, it's incredibly messy to do that. So I recommend doing a premix. So this is my premix container, highly recommended. And then you need some kind of pitcher to pour your filtered water into your starter with. I use this fancy blue little pitcher because it's fancy and it's blue. And then the last tool for starter maintenance, almost as important as your digital scale, is this little thing, which is called a spoonula. Somebody recommended this, and it is the perfect tool for starter maintenance. It's called a spoonula because I guess its mother is a spoon and its father is a spatula. And basically you can use this as a spoon for spooning your flour into your starter, but then it also has this really nice silicone spatula tip, so that after you've mixed your starter, you can stir it up with the spoonula. Then you can scrape down the insides of your jar, which is very, very important because you want to keep your starter jar clean. This is really the perfect tool. I don't know who came up with this, but it works perfectly for this purpose, so I highly recommend the spoonula. So that's my starter maintenance kit. That's everything you need for your daily maintenance of your starter. Now let's talk about the tools that we need for mixing the dough. Before we start mixing, the first thing that you need every time you start a bake is you need a recipe. I follow the Tartine Bread Basic Country Loaf recipe. If you're using a recipe off of the internet, I recommend printing a copy of it so you always have your recipe handy in case you need to reference that. In addition to the recipe, I strongly recommend keeping notes of each one of your bakes. So what I've done, because I do the same recipe very often, is I printed out a worksheet that I created that has a shorthand version of all the steps in the recipe on it. It has little boxes in here where I can fill in all the times, temperatures, notes, so that I can go back at the end of my bake and I can see all the things that I did so I can learn from what went right and what went wrong. So I highly recommend either creating a cheat sheet or using a baker's notebook or something like that. But keeping a log of your bakes, it will definitely help you learn more quickly. And then obviously you need a pencil nearby to take notes copiously throughout the process. Okay, so now we're ready to mix the dough. Really basic needs for mixing is you need some mixing bowls. I prefer to use a glass bowl. And there are a couple features I like about this. One is it has a flat bottom, so it really sits nicely on my countertop. Like here's an example. If I use this bowl, this stainless steel bowl, and tried to mix in this, I mean, this thing is all over the place. I can't use that bowl. I don't recommend that. You want a bowl that's going to sit flat on your countertop. In addition, I like to have a flat bottomed glass bowl because there are many times where you're going to be measuring the height of your dough, so it's nice to be able to pick up your dough and look at it like this and see what the height is. So I recommend the glass bowl. But in addition to my main mixing bowl, I also need a pre-mixing bowl sometimes. So this recipe that I follow calls for 90% bread flour, 10% whole wheat flour. I want to blend those together before I put them in my bowl with the water. Otherwise, you'll get a big clump of whole wheat flour sitting in the middle of your bread flour. So just having an extra bowl sitting around for pre-mixing is handy. In this example, if I wanted to pre-mix this flour, I use this whisk. So a whisk like this is handy for pre-mixing. And then the whisk is also very handy when you do the step of mixing your water with your leaven. So I'll put the water in this bowl, I add the leaven in this bowl, and then you have to dissolve the starter into the leaven or into the water, at least in this recipe. This kitchen whisk works perfectly for that, where you can really create a frothy mix of your water and your starter or your leaven. So I strongly recommend the whisk. That's a handy tool. You can also buy a dough whisk. There's something that people typically use. It's a little bit different shaped version of this. Some people love a dough whisk as well for mixing the dough. I don't happen to use one of those, but that's a common tool that you'll see many people recommend. Then you need some type of vessel for your water. I recommend a glass vessel like this. This has milliliters marked on one side of it. Again, it's glass, so if I put things in here, I can look through it and see what the level is very easily. And most importantly, I can microwave this because there are many times in these recipes where you need to bring up your water to a certain temperature before you add it to the dough. So you're constantly heating your water up in the microwave. So you want to have a glass pitcher. I like this one, but I can't microwave this. So you can't, I just don't use metal pitchers for that purpose because I can't put them in the microwave. One of the most important things in the mixing process is this. And you'll say, what the heck is this? This is my salt bowl. You're like, the salt bowl, what is it? I never heard of this. One of the most common things that happens with baking sourdough bread, one of the common mistakes, is people forget to add the salt. I don't know why this happens. It's like a mental block, but it happens so frequently. I'm on a lot of social media groups, and on a daily basis, you see people, saying, oh my gosh, I forgot the salt. Now what do I do? So as I'm starting to mix my ingredients, I always have my salt bowl first. I put this in a very visible place. I pre-measure my salt before I do anything, and I leave it right in front of my eyes to make sure that I don't forget the salt. You'll probably say, this guy's crazy. Like, you're really gonna use a special bowl for salt. And then sometime months down the road, you'll actually forget to add the salt to your recipe. So then you can come back to my YouTube video, add the comments and say, you were right. I should have used the salt bowl. I didn't do it and I forgot to add the salt. But it's up to you if you want to do that or not. I just know that's going to happen. A couple other specialized tools here. I talked about the thermometer. With the starter maintenance, you always want to have a thermometer in addition on your countertop so you know what your countertop temperature is. There are some recipes that call for countertop proofing or countertop bulk fermentation. My room temperature could be 77 degrees in here. It could be 62 degrees. That's an incredibly wide variation of room temperature. So I always like to have a thermometer sitting right here as I'm baking so I know what my countertop temperature is. And then you also need a digital probe thermometer. This is an incredibly important tool. And again, this is one you probably want to go buy. If you don't have a digital probe thermometer, there are all kinds of these kitchen thermometers. You can buy inexpensive ones like this. You can buy very expensive ones like this. They all work pretty well. But you will need this probe thermometer throughout the process. You'll need to measure your water temperature when the recipe calls for heating up your water. You'll need to measure your dough temperature when you've mixed up your dough and the recipe says that your dough should be a certain temperature. And then particularly during bulk fermentation, I take the temperature of my dough probably 10 or 15 times during that process. It's very, very important to know what your dough temperature is during the bulk fermentation process. And then obviously you need a thermometer when you take your dough out of the oven and you want to test to see if it's done. So I recommend investing in a good digital probe thermometer. This is a tool that you will use a lot. A couple other items here. The bowl scraper, very important. You can buy, a 4-pack of these for $6 or $8. When you're mixing the dough in your bowl, it's very helpful to have this bowl scraper so that you can scrape the flour off the side of the bowl. This is just a specialized tool, very handy for bread baking because the flour is so sticky and it wants to stick to the bowl. You'll end up using this dough scraper a lot. I also recommend a kitchen timer. You can use your watch, you could use your phone, you could use your digital personal assistant. I just like having an old-fashioned kitchen timer sitting on the countertop because you're going to be setting timers throughout the process. So, I use this a dozen times over the next day or so as I'm baking. Those are all the items for mixing the dough. At the end of mixing, then we start bulk fermentation. In bulk fermentation, this is where you've basically mixed the dough and you're doing some stretching and folding of the dough typically, and you're watching the dough to rise. So you need a vessel where you can really measure an increase in the change in volume. So it's very hard to do that with a flat bottom bowl like this. If you put your dough in this bowl and the recipe says wait until it rises 20 or 30%, it's incredibly hard to tell where 20% is on this bowl for two reasons. One is the bottom of the bowl is narrower than the top of the bowl. So as you're rising, your volume and your height are not equal in a bowl like this. And it's also just hard to tell because there are no markers on this bowl at all. So what people use for bulk fermentation is two types of containers. There's something like this. This is a different brand, but there's something called a Cambro container, which a lot of people use. It's a food storage container. It has liter markings on the side. It's usually a rectangular or a cylindrical vessel like this. These are perfect. This is the perfect shape container for bulk fermentation because the height equals the volume. So this is the same size on the bottom as it is on the top. So if you're measuring the height of the dough and you're expecting it to rise 50%, 50% increase in height is a 50% increase in volume. And it also just it causes your dough to stand up a little taller. So you just see the percent rise more easily than you would if you were in a big flat bottom bowl like this. So I recommend a tall, narrow vessel like this for bulk fermentation, preferably one that has straight sides on it. The other option is something like this, which is taller, which is good. I can see through the sides of it because it's glass, but it's an irregular shape where the bottom is more narrow than the top. But this has my liter measures on the side. So I actually use this for my bulk fermentation. So I can tell when I achieve my 30%, 40%, 50% rise because this marks the liters on it. If you're using an irregular shaped vessel like this, you must have these liter markers on here because in a vessel like this, the change in height is not equal to the change in volume. And when a recipe calls for a doubling in your dough or a 50% rise in the dough, that is measuring the change in volume, not the change in height. So you have to have something that measures the change in volume. Very, very important if you're going to be particular about your measurements for bulk fermentation. Lastly, when you are doing bulk fermentation, the recipe usually calls for covering your dough as you're letting it sit. So you can use plastic wrap, you could use foil. I recommend, and a lot of people use these, some people call these shower caps. This is a food grade version of a shower cap. It's called an elastic food cover. You can buy a whole bag of these for a few bucks, and these last a long time. I've been using this for months. So these elastic food covers, very, very handy. Also, when your dough goes into the refrigerator, if you're doing an overnight final proof, you can use these covers on there as well. So I recommend getting a bag of the elastic food covers. And then there's always the good old-fashioned, kitchen towel, where some people like to leave their dough on the countertop. And when it says to cover it, just cover it with a kitchen towel. I do this sometimes too. This is kind of the retro way to do it. I do this, I like it. Have some favorite towels. As you can see, this one's a little ragged. I've had it for a long time. It's handy to have some of those kitchen towels lying around as well. Before we move on, let's talk a little bit about proofing chambers. This is something related to bulk fermentation, and it's when you need to increase your dough temperature and get it above your room temperature. So a lot of the recipes, for example, this recipe calls for your bulk fermentation internal dough temperature to be 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 25.5 to 27.8 degrees Celsius. That's typically higher than your room temperature, your countertop temperature. So you need to figure out a way to bring your ambient temperature up so that you can bring your dough temperature up. The way that people do that is through a proofing chamber. The easiest way to do this is you can buy these things. There's proofing boxes that you can buy. It's a little pop-up box that is plastic. You can store it it folds down. You pop it up, it has a lid on it, it has walls on it, you turn a thermostat on it, and it creates an enclosed chamber with the perfect temperature. That's the easy way to do it. But those things are a little bit expensive, they're a little bit bulky to store, so a lot of people try to come up with improvised proofing chambers. The most common one is using your oven with the light turned on. If you turn the light bulb on inside your oven, that'll create a nice warm environment. Very important to know what the temperature in there is though, so you need one of these little thermometers. So I'll turn the oven light on about an hour before I need it, put one of these thermometers in there. My oven with the light on will get up between 85 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a really perfect temperature for the type of bulk fermentation that I do. Sometimes in the winter, the oven temperature doesn't come up very quickly because the house is cold and the light bulb just doesn't throw off enough heat. So another trick you can use with really any enclosed space is fill up this pitcher with water, put this in your microwave and bring it to a boil, and then put this pitcher of boiling water into your oven or into your microwave or into a box or into a cabinet, into some enclosed space with your dough. And this water, if you bring it up to a boil, will bring up the temperature by anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees. So it's a very easy way to do it. And then this will cool down over maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours. You pop it back in the microwave, heat it up again, and you can really control the temperature of an enclosed space just by using a pitcher of boiling water. Some other examples that people use for proofing is I have a warming drawer down here that has a proof setting on it, but that's really more for commercial yeast. So even at the lowest temperature, that warming drawer, if I put a thermometer in there, it gets up to over 100 degrees, which is too warm for proofing sourdough. I could probably figure out a way to do it by leaving the drawer open and let some of that heat out, but I've never messed with that because I just use my oven with the light on. The other thing some people do is they use their microwave oven with the door ajar. Similar to your oven, the microwave light will turn on with the door ajar, and it'll create a warm space inside the microwave oven. And again, if it's not warm enough, fill up a pitcher with boiling water, put that in your microwave, you've just created a warm environment. Some people use seed warming mats. You can buy a mat with a thermostat on it, set your dough on top of that. Some people use reptile warming mats. These are the things that go in the bottom of aquariums. If you keep reptiles, they'll bring the temperature of an enclosed space up by about 10 degrees. So, be creative, but always be safe, especially if you're using a light bulb or some type of heating element. Make sure that you're not creating an environment where you could start a fire. But always start with the oven with the light turned on is usually a good option. The vast majority of people do that. If it's not warm enough, add a pitcher of boiling water. So now we're done with bulk fermentation. Let's talk about the tools that we need for dough shaping. So I finished bulk fermentation. I'm ready to dump the dough out onto my countertop. You can dump the dough directly onto your countertop. This is a granite countertop. Some people have wood countertops, Formica, whatever. It doesn't really matter. You've probably seen I have the silicone mat on my countertop. I prefer to use this throughout the process for a number of reasons. One, when I'm mixing the dough, this gives me a nice surface where my bowls don't slide around on it. So when you're aggressively mixing, stirring, whatever, it just gives a nice grippy surface. The second thing I like about this is that it catches the flour. So when you're spilling flour, it's going over the side of your bowl, it'll stick to this mat. Whereas if it gets on my countertop, it just spreads into the entire room. So it's a good tool as a flour catcher. And then the third most obvious thing is for shaping. This has a little grip to it. So when you're shaping your dough, there's a step in the process where you're basically dragging the dough towards you to create some friction and seal the bottom of the dough. This creates a really grippy surface. Some people might prefer a really smooth surface. I prefer a little grippier surface for that step of the shaping process. It's totally your preference if you want to use something like this or not. But I really like this because it keeps my kitchen clean. It really keeps all the flour really in one spot. Okay, so we take the dough out of our vessel that we use for bulk fermentation. We dump it onto our countertop, and then you need to flour the dough. I like to use this little shaker. I just have bread flour in here. This is a typical kitchen shaker that you would use to shake confection or sugar or something like that. I just put bread flour in here and I label it flour so I know what's in there. And this is really convenient for doing a very light dusting. There are some other real specialized tools for doing a very light dusting of flour that you'll see some people use, but it's helpful to have something like that. The next thing you'll need is a bench scraper, or sometimes called a bench knife. Now this is a little thicker, larger than my bowl scraper. The bowl scraper really isn't large enough for cutting and shaping the dough, although some people might try to use that. This bench scraper is a little bit more effective. So this is the tool that you use to cut the dough. So when you make this double recipe of the tartine bread, it breaks 2 loaves. So you want to cut that in half. This is the tool that you use for that. And then when you're shaping the dough, you're using this in one hand or using your other hand, and you're basically turning the dough for the shaping. You can see all kinds of videos on how to shape your loaves. This is the basic tool that people use. And this is also helpful just for cleaning up your countertop, for scraping up bits of dough and scraping up flour and things of that nature. Very, very handy tool, very inexpensive. That's your bench scraper. So now I've shaped my dough, and the next step is to put it into my shaping baskets. Now, a lot of people who bake sourdough bread use the traditional shaping baskets from France called bannetons. Those are basically a wicker style, cane style wound basket that's been used for probably hundreds of years for shaping your loaves. I don't use bannetons, although I have every other tool imaginable. I've just never, it's just not my style. I just don't like that look of the bread. So I do makeshift bannetons, which anybody can do. So if you're making batards, you basically want to keep your dough in a rectangular shape. I just use this loaf pan. I put one of these flour sack cloths in here. I cover this with a mix of white rice flour and white bread flour, 50-50 mix. And this is my banneton shaper. Sometimes I make half-size loaves. Here's my mini banneton shaper. Same thing. You just use the mix of rice flour. Some people use 100% rice flour. I do a mix of rice flour and bread flour. There's my small banneton. And then similarly, if I want to do the standard size boule, here's my boule shaper, makeshift banneton. That's the perfect size and shape. Looks just like a banneton. Put your towel in there. And there's my shaper for my full-size boule. I can do half-size boules. So look around. Some people use colanders for this. You could really use anything. It's really just to keep the shape of your loaf. And if you have something like this, these are called flour sack cloths. I get these down in Amish country in central Ohio. It's a very kind of tight woven linen, I believe. Very easy to wash, very easy to keep clean. You can line your bannetons or makeshift bannetons with those. When I'm dusting the flour sack cloths for my bannetons, I said I use a mix of 50% rice flour, 50% white flour. Here's another, thing I recommend. Do a premix. Instead of bringing your flour bags back out, I just do a premix of 50-50. I keep it here. I have it labeled clearly what's in here. So I always have my premix ready. Try to keep your flour bags to a minimum. If you're always doing the same premix, mix up a couple of those premix batches. So now I'm ready to put my bannetons in the refrigerator. If I'm doing an overnight proof, it calls for them to be covered. I'm back with my shower cap or my elastic food cover. I cover my bowl with this in the refrigerator. Very handy to have, a half dozen of these lying around. So now I'm done with shaping. When I put my loaves into the refrigerator, they always travel with their own thermometer. So I put my cover on this, I put it in the refrigerator with the thermometer. There's a significant difference in temperature in your refrigerator depending on what shelf you put your dough on. So it's really important to have a thermometer with it. If I put this on the top shelf of my refrigerator, it might be 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If I put it on the bottom shelf, it might be 36 or 35 degrees Fahrenheit. If I put it in the back of the refrigerator, it's colder than in the front of the refrigerator. So your dough should always travel with a thermometer in my recommendation. So that's it for shaping. Now let's talk about the tools that we need for baking. So we've done an overnight proof. We're ready to score our loaves. So let's talk about the tools required for scoring. The classic tools required for scoring is something called a lame. This is the French word for blade, I believe. This is kind of the classic version of a lame. It's basically a razor blade on the end of a stick. You can buy all kinds of these, but they all use the same type of thing. It's basically a double-edged razor blade. You can buy a box of those, and then some way to hold the blade. There are some really creative things out there. I'd suggest look for different versions of these and just find something that you would personally like based on personal preference. This particular version tends to curve the blade a little bit, which some people prefer. There are other versions that keep the blade really straight. That's really the main difference between the lame. You can also use, you know, common kitchen knife. Just find your sharpest possible knife. I have this knife that's almost like a razor sharp blade. I could use this for scoring my loaves. It works almost as effectively as the lame. You can use a box cutter. This is a traditional old-time box cutter. This doesn't really expose enough of the blade, though you'll find that this is a little shallow. So what some people do is they'll just take the blade out of this. This is a single edge razor blade, so I can put my finger on the back side of it without cutting myself. And that just gives me a really versatile tool for scoring. I actually prefer just that single edge razor blade like that. Some people will grab the double edge razor blade from their lame. I don't even want to take that off because I might cut myself. I think that's crazy. I mean, people are just holding the edge of a razor blade with your finger. That's kind of silly and it's dangerous. I don't recommend that. If you want to hold the blade, get a single edge blade. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to hold a double edge blade the way people do. I don't know why they do that. If you work in the medical profession, you might have a scalpel that you want to use. If you're into crafts, this is a craft knife that has, you know, the little craft blade on it. Some people use these. I tried this a few times. It was no better than just using the razor blade, but some people who are really into crafts might be real familiar with those. Those are your options for scoring. Now, as we get ready for baking the loaves, you'll want to preheat your oven, and one of the things I recommend that you do at least once, we really should do it occasionally, is get one of these inexpensive oven thermometers and check the calibration of the temperature in your oven. So you'll be required to preheat your oven to 500 degrees. Put this in there a few times and test it. Sometimes your oven temperature thermostats are incorrect. You might heat it to 500, the bell will go off, and your oven temperature will be 450 degrees. I mean, it's not uncommon for some oven thermostats to be off by 30, 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit in one direction or the other. The other thing that's important is if you're heating up your Dutch oven, preheating it, I recommend putting this thermometer inside the Dutch oven a few times, because whether you heat it with the lid on or even with the lid off, the inside of the Dutch oven will heat up much more slowly than the ambient temperature in your oven. So your oven will tell you it's 500 degrees. If you preheat your Dutch oven with the lid on, and I've done a test of this, the inside of your Dutch oven will only be 350 degrees Fahrenheit when your oven temperature tells you the oven is at 500. If you take the lid off, so you preheat it with the lid off, the inside of the Dutch oven will still be 50, 75, 100 degrees cooler than the oven temperature, even with the lid off, which is really hard to believe, but it just takes a while for that real heavy material in the Dutch oven to come up to temperature. So test your oven a couple times just to get familiar with how long you need to preheat it to really bring it up to temperature. Speaking of Dutch ovens, let's look at what Dutch oven I use. So the most common baking vessel that people use and what's often recommended is a Dutch oven. You can use a cast iron combo cooker. You can use a cast iron Dutch oven. This happens to be an enamel covered cast iron Dutch oven just because this is what I happen to own, so I use it and it works really well. This is a 6-quart Dutch oven, which works really well for boules and for half-size batards. I can actually put my half-size, which I mentioned I use in this shaping vessel. I can put a half-size batard in here. A full-size batard in a round 6-quart Dutch oven is a little tight. You're really going to have to squeeze that in. So if you're doing full-size batards, you might want to look at a different vessel. Some people bake their bread in the oven on a pizza stone, which is perfectly acceptable. Some people bake it in a roasting pan with a lid on it. There are tons of options for baking vessels in the oven. The main thing and the reason that people recommend a Dutch oven is for 2 reasons. There are 2 things you're trying to achieve when you're baking bread. One is you want to be able to create and trap steam. So commercial bakeries typically inject steam into their ovens. A lot of people don't have steam injection ovens. So you want to trap steam in there. That's what this heavy lid of the Dutch oven does. When you put your bread in here, It's loaded with liquid. You put that lid on, bring it up to 450 or 500 degrees. It creates a steam chamber inside your oven. So that's the first reason people use a covered vessel. The second thing that you're trying to do with a Dutch oven is you're trying to replicate the super high heat of a commercial bakery. So a commercial bakery oven might be 900 degrees, for example, Fahrenheit. By putting your bread in the Dutch oven, you're basically creating an oven inside your oven. You're bringing the walls of the oven much closer to the loaf of bread through these heavy walls of the Dutch oven. So you're trying to approximate that very hot, radiant heat of a commercial oven at a lower temperature, which is the temperature of a typical kitchen oven, which might get up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. One problem that people have with Dutch ovens is that they will burn your bread on the bottom. There is a simple fix for this. If you take a cookie sheet and put this on a rack below the rack that your Dutch oven is on, it creates a buffer between the bottom of your oven, especially if you have a heating element on the bottom of your oven. It hits the cookie sheet like this. It diverts that hot air around the edges. Then you have another rack sitting on top of this, so there's a space between the cookie sheet, the next rack, and then the bottom of the Dutch oven. So it keeps that super high heat from coming off of the bottom of your oven right against the bottom of the Dutch oven just by creating a thermal break. Is really what you're doing with this. It works perfectly. I was burning the bottom of my bread all the time. I did that one time, it fixed it. I mean, that's just, it works incredibly well. In addition to the big Dutch oven, I also have this mini Dutch oven for making small boules. You don't really need different size Dutch ovens for different size loaves. I thought that if I put a small loaf in the big Dutch oven, it would spread out and flatten out. So I bought this little mini Dutch oven. They actually don't spread out. If you're doing good shaping and you have good gluten development, your loaf shouldn't really touch the sides of your Dutch oven. I learned that after a while, but now I have two, so I can bake two loaves at the same time. So that's also not a bad option if you're baking a lot of loaves. When you put your loaves into your Dutch oven, you want to dust the bottoms with rice flour typically, or cornmeal, something on the bottom of your loaf. And then I strongly recommend using parchment paper to line the bottom of your Dutch oven so that you can, number one, keep it from burning, and number two, it gives you an easier way to lift the bread out of the Dutch oven. But if you just take a rectangular piece of parchment paper like this and you stuff it in your Dutch oven, it presses in on the bread and it'll actually misshapen the bread. And if you get these ears hanging over the edge and I put my lid on, then I'm letting steam exit through that little gap that I've created. So a trick that I saw somebody do, which I highly recommend, is you make a sling, and there are different varieties of how you do this. I'll do the simple one where I cut a diamond shape. So I just cut basically a diamond-shaped sling. I put my loaf of bread on it like this, and I lower it down into my Dutch oven, and look at that, it sits perfectly in the bottom, so it doesn't impede the shape of the bread, and it leaves these two handles on the sides, so when I take this out of the oven and it's 500 degrees or 450 degrees, I can carefully lift my bread out of the Dutch oven on my little sling. Very common technique that a lot of people use. I highly recommend that. Then let's talk about kitchen safety. It's incredibly dangerous baking sourdough bread. You're working with razor blades, very sharp. You're working with 500-degree cast iron, which can burn you in an instant. So another thing that you should invest in is a good oven mitt or pair of oven mitts. This will save you a lot of injury. And it's very important to be safe when you're in your kitchen. So I like this mitt because it's a super high heat mitt. I can grab 500 or 550 degree Dutch oven with this. And I like the way that the sleeve comes up like this to protect your forearm. You'll hear people joke about bakers' tattoos, which are basically burn marks up your forearm. So this will protect you from burning yourself. I also like these silicone gripping pot holders. If you really need a good grip on something, these are a little bit more versatile than something like this. These really, I can't even hold this thing. I don't recommend those. But this one is grippy. So sometimes when you really need a firm grip on something and you don't want to have a mitt on both hands, I recommend these. But there's one thing to note. These have a hanging hole in them. And for whatever reason, 99% of the time, your thumb will find that hole. So you're pulling something out of the oven, you go to grab your 500-degree Dutch oven and you put your thumb through that hole, you get a 500-degree burn right on your thumb. It's not pretty. So just be careful with these because of that hole. Some of them don't have a hole, but the vast majority of them do. So now we've baked the loaves, we take them out of the oven. First thing we do, take the temperature. So our thermometer is back. You'll use this more than any other tool, at least I do. So having a good thermometer is great. You want your bread to be 210 to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 100 degrees Celsius on the inside to ensure that it's baked on the inside. And then when you take your loaves out of the oven, I like to have a brush like this. This is something I got at the hardware store. It's just a stiff bristle brush, and I use this to brush the rice flour or any white flour off of the side of my loaves so that they look pretty, and nobody wants to have like a mouthful of raw flour when you bite into your loaf. So I like to get the flour off of my loaf. And then lastly, once your loaves have sufficiently cooled, you need a great bread knife. This one I strongly recommend. This is the Mercer Culinary 10-inch wavy knife. This is a superb bread knife. There are all kinds of great bread knives out there. This one is very inexpensive. This is less than $20. You can buy, really high-end knives for $200. This one does the job. I also recommend this sheath for it. This was an extra $3 or something because it protects your blade. So I only use this for bread making. I don't use it for anything else. And the other thing I like about this sheath is it makes a great sound when you take the blade out. So I really like to do that. So you're ready to slice into your loaf. You should have a good cutting board. Some cutting boards, I recommend the wood cutting board just because it's traditional and I like the look of it. This cutting board has, it's just wood on both sides. This thing slides all over the place. Like if I'm trying to cut my bread, this thing doesn't work. This cutting board has rubber grippers on the bottom. I recommend something like this. Just gives you a little bit firmer footing when you're cutting, because it's pretty tough to cut through the crust of your bread, and some people will cut themselves because you're using sharp knives. It's tough to cut through the crust, and your cutting board is moving all over the place. So again, from a safety perspective, you want a firm base to be cutting your loaves on. And if you get something that's wood, it looks nice. So now I've cut my loaf, and people ask the question, how should I store my freshly cut loaf to keep it fresh? This really varies depending on what type of bread you're making, what the hydration percentages of the bread, what the humidity of your house is. It's all over the map, so I really don't have kind of a one-size-fits-all recommendation. But the things that a lot of people use, techniques they use, number one is for at least a day, maybe longer, you can just, once you cut your loaf, you can store the cut side down on your cutting board, and it'll stay fresh easily for a day without wrapping it, putting it in a bag or anything like that. Just put the cut side down. You get at least a day freshness depending on how quickly you eat it. If you plan to keep your bread a little longer, you can put it in a brown paper bag. This will let it breathe a little bit. It keeps the crust crunchy and crusty, but it'll keep the bread from getting stale. That works okay. Doesn't last for a long time. Some people will wrap it in plastic wrap. I find that if you put your bread in an airtight seal, it will start to sweat because there's so much moisture in your sourdough bread even after baking it. Be real careful about sealing it up tightly in plastic, so I don't recommend that. One thing I do recommend is this other variety of plastic wrap that actually has a food-safe adhesive on one side. So when you cut your loaf, you tear off a piece of this and just stick it on that cut side of the loaf overnight, for example, and leave the loaf on your countertop. and that'll just keep air from getting into the crumb. That actually works pretty well. Some people will wrap their loaf in foil. That breathes a little bit more than wrapping it in plastic. That works as well. And then a technique that I use, and again, this is just based on the types of loaves that I make and the humidity in my house at this time of year, is on day 1, I leave the cut side down. On day 2, I'll take the cut loaf and I'll put it inside the Ziploc bag, but I will not seal it. I'll just put it in here and I'll kind of let the bag partially close like that, but I will leave it open, and that actually keeps it incredibly fresh, and it does not allow moisture to build up in here. If I seal this bag and come back the next morning, there will be water condensation inside of this bag. You cannot seal it airtight. So I leave the bag open on day 2. Then on day 3, it starts to get a little bit more stale. I'll seal this about halfway. And then on day 4, I'll seal it about 3/4 of the way. I never made it to day 5 without eating all of the bread, so I can't help you with what happens after that. If you want to store your bread in the freezer, I recommend slicing it when it's fresh, putting it in a bag sliced, and then you can take slices out for toast or sandwiches or whatever. I do that all the time. It works really well. I just store it in one of those Ziplocs. Some people will wrap their bread in foil or plastic wrap and put it in the freezer and then take it out and bake it again for 10 minutes. That's an option that works as well. Lastly, the most important tool that you need is the butter knife for spreading butter on your bread so you can eat the bread. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.